This is fun. This is data migration for Drupal 7. So hopefully you're in the right room. I'm Ken Rickard. I'm a developer and what we call team lead, which means I manage other developers on big projects for Palantir.net. I've done a couple of projects for a big company down the street that I'm still not allowed to talk about. That's kind of fun. We'll talk about some other stuff. I'm a core contributor. I'm actually number 45 on the Drupal 7 patch list. Woo. Lots of little alter hooks. How many people in the room have ever used hook module enabled? That's mine. Lots of little things that make developers' lives easier, I think. I'm also most well known for the domain access module, which is one of mine also. And the people who helped me create it are actually in the back of the room, which is great. And we're doing Workbench stuff, but I'm not doing a Workbench presentation today. That's okay. And I'm one of the co-authors of Drupal 7 module development, which I think at least one table out there has for sale. So you should go get a copy. I'm also one of the 6 people in the world who understands the Node Access API. And I forgot I'm not using PowerPoint. I tried to hit the next. For various geeky reasons, my entire slide presentation today is one single PHP file with giant arrays describing stuff. So why am I here talking about migration? So I've been working at Palantir for 3.5 years, and I was joking with my old buddy Art Times, who's in the back there. Hi, Art. 5 years ago, when we started using Drupal up in Augusta, Georgia, we had to get data out of a legacy Oracle system and into Drupal 4.6. And we said, Art, please parse some XML and shove it into 4.6 for us. And it took Art like a long time because, you know, both PHP and Drupal were much less mature then. And it was a painful, painful thing. So basically, I mean, we needed a senior level engineer to solve this problem. Right. In the intervening years, after I left that job and I started working at Palantir, I do a lot of data migrations. And data migrations are funny because they're that thing where if you're successful once, you get tagged with being that guy. And you're always going to do the data migration. So these are 3 examples, and they're interesting examples to me for the following reasons. ForeignAffairs.com, fascinating project. Foreign Affairs is, of course, it's the Council on Foreign Relations magazine. Most major U.S. foreign policy initiatives back to the Cold War were first published in Foreign Affairs. So for that project, they gave me 14,000 XML files and said, please put these into Drupal. This was in Drupal 6. Grinnell College was fascinating. Grinnell said, hey, we have a flat file HTML publishing system that uses server-side includes to take 4 files together and assemble them into one page. Can you import that into Drupal for us? That was fun. That was also a Drupal 6 project. Both of those, I should say, I sort of get ahead of myself. Did anyone in here go to the 11 o'clock talk by Nicole Lind upstairs? Those of you who didn't, you totally missed out. For you the developers in the room, I encourage you when you go to camps and cons, the code stuff you can always pick up later. Go to the PM sessions. That's where all the really interesting stuff's going on. So Nicole talked about the pains of getting stuff into Drupal and the risks associated with migrating big projects into Drupal. Both of those first 2 projects had about 80 hours for automated data migration budgets. And they're both D6 projects, and they both required custom code. The NPR News Archive, which I'm going to demo for you live today, and it works because I demoed it for myself again this morning. The NPR News Archive had an 80-hour budget based on previous experience. That data migration actually took 34 hours, of which at least 12 of those hours were simply data analysis. But the actual programming, implementation, and debugging took about 20 hours. Fascinating. So there I am, 50 hours under budget on a project. So fascinated by that. And the sort of why. Data migration is one of these fascinating things. I mean, how many people in this room are actually trying to solve a data migration problem right now? Me too, yeah. And it's interesting, since I wrote this slide a while back, Curve, the company founded by Moshe Weitzman and Mike Ryan, has since been bought by Acquia. It's such a growth opportunity. So the one Drupal firm that was specializing in data migrations got swallowed up by Acquia. But I would, sort of put that out there as a sort of business lesson for those of you who are here as developers. There are niches like this in the Drupal community, and you might think about, if you find yourself solving the same problem over and over again, you are probably not alone, and there might be something more to it. So I think this is fascinating. Now, typically when you ask developers to do a migration, and I told someone in the hallway that they were a non-technical person. I said, well, stay for the first 15 minutes, and then when I pull out the command line, you can leave, right? This is typically what happens when someone says, please migrate my data into Drupal. This actually happens when you ask anyone to migrate data anywhere. And this drives me absolutely bat crazy. I censored myself. Good for me. Absolutely drives me crazy. What in the world is going on here in the middle, right? You want to know. And if your editors aren't involved, if your project sponsors are not involved in that middle stage, you're not going to get what you want. So I love this little slide. There are 5 basic things you can do to get data into Drupal. This is the sort of list. You can write custom scripts. A lot of people do that, actually. They'll write like Perl scripts and things to just shove data into the database, which I do not recommend. Largely because a lot of things that are hidden in the Drupal API only work properly if you call node save, and you can't do that from a Perl script. A lot of custom Drupal modules. I used to do a lot. Well, in Drupal 6, my basic modus was I'm going to build a custom batch API implementation. That worked pretty well. Feeds. Feeds is a very interesting module, and if we have time later, we'll talk about why I don't use feeds for this kind of work. Import API is sort of I want to say, a noble but flawed attempt to solve this problem in interesting ways. I'm going to spend actually all of my time today talking about Migrate and the Migrate module work that the guys at Curve have done, and why it's going to make your life a lot easier, and you can come in, what, 55% under budget on your next migration project, maybe. So the first thing you have to do is know where your source data is coming from, right? You have to know what your data sources are. You have to do analysis of this. And you have to, from that, as a developer, you have to structure your Drupal objects. This is true of any kind of data migration that you're going to do. The big thing that I'm going to say is you must then document these assumptions in plain English. And I believe I have an example. The data migration that I just did was Oracle to Drupal, and the Oracle data that I was given was spread across 5 database tables that had a combined total of about 80 fields. And then inside those 80 fields, they had a lot of key value pairs. Yeah, so there was something like 300 possible combinations of data that I might or might not care about. And so I had to go to them and say, hey, this reference field in this database table, that doesn't look relevant to anything you're doing on the website, right or wrong. And the trick is you have to be able to write this in a fairly easy to read, fairly human way, so that your project managers or your project spokespeople or the CEO or the CTO or anyone involved in the project on a non-technical level who has to give you sign-off can actually read this and go, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense. And you see in this notes column is really, really helpful for them too. In the case of this project, we're bringing across 20,000 records and the associated audio files of radio broadcasts going back to 1974. So this one here, transcript file, is kind of fascinating. Is this MP3 file, which is stored in their database, just an EA asset ID. And one of the things was that you have to work out at this stage is, well, what am I going to do with that? Am I going to try to reach out and grab that MP3 file off a server somewhere and shove it into Drupal as a file object? This kind of process lets you answer those questions, right? The other thing it lets you do, of course, is get your head around what the data looks like, because very, very frequently, unless you're dealing with something like, Vignette that has a clear migration path, a lot of times you're going to find yourself, how many of you doing migrations are doing them from custom systems? How many of those custom systems are documented? Yeah, so in this case, the custom system was called Itasca. The Itasca developer quit 3 years ago, and they've been limping along ever since because they don't know how it works. They don't know what their data store is. They don't know what their model is, and I literally had to go through it for them. They were nice enough to actually pull out just the 5 tables I cared about instead of giving me all 90 tables. because I'm not importing users. So anyway, but this process is absolutely critical, right? And you have to get everybody on board and say, okay, this is how we want to present it. And all of these data elements, these Drupal fields over here on the left column, all map to actual elements in the user interface. They're all actual functionality. So I love this slide too. This is the hierarchy of pain when you're doing data migrations. Blue is good and red is not. Doing MySQL to PostgreSQL data migrations are almost seamless these days. It's very, very easy because Drupal natively talks to those things. Other types of SQL data is pretty good. There are some pretty reliable Oracle and MS SQL drivers in Drupal these days. And converting data from those two, like what we did, they literally just sent me an Oracle dump as a MySQL file, which is a much easier way for me to deal with it. XML data is kind of good. You can do a lot with it. I would put CSV data in that category as well. HTML you can do. For those of you who were in the presentation upstairs this morning, I promised to tell you how. I'm not going to show you how, but I'll tell you how. And then, yeah, you could be stuck with a bunch of old Word documents. When you get to this bottom point, you basically have to tell them to hire, interns, because you cannot fix a bunch of old Word documents. We tried to solve that problem once, but we didn't. So this is a nice thing to figure out too. And one of your jobs as a developer is to push your client as high up this chart as you can before you get started, right? You're like, oh, you got Oracle data. Can you give me that in a MySQL dump or something like that? And quite frequently they will. With Foreign Affairs, I spent, I don't know, a couple hours on the upfront standardizing and agreeing to their XML specification, which had things in it like, in my programming notes that they signed off on, it would say things like this. If a document fails to parse with simple XML, it will be rejected, marked as improperly formatted, and returned to the client for correction. And they signed off on that. And out of 14,000 documents, we rejected like 85 of them. Wasn't a big deal. But you want to do that kind of thing up front. It is, again, to quote Nicole from upstairs, that is a risk mitigation strategy. So helpful tools on your way in Drupal 7, and I'm only going to be talking about Drupal 7 today. Some of these same tools exist in Drupal 6. They're not quite as mature, but database, the next generation, the so-called new database API in Drupal 7 actually makes a lot of this very, very easy. Simple XML is your friend because Simple XML does complex XML data parsing in a pretty simple way. Query path. Now, query path I'll stop and talk just a minute about, because if you're stuck with a bunch of old HTML documents and you don't know what to do with them, you need to go to querypath.org and figure out what that's about. Querypath is a PHP library written by a guy I used to work with named Matt Butcher, and Matt is a genius. And we were having these problems. We had to parse documents over and over again, things like that. And he was finding maddening inconsistencies. Imagine that. Maddening inconsistencies in PHP. Like libxml would do certain things but not other things. And some of the other libraries like Simple XML would do some things and not other things. So he wrote a layer that sits on top of libxml that basically functions like jQuery in PHP. So query path lets you use jQuery style selectors to say things like this. Rip in an HTML document and find me every instance of the image tag, right? Now iterate through those and rip out the source parameter as a value and stick it into an object for me. And then you take that object and you do whatever you want to with it, right? It's really, really powerful, and it's actually really, really easy because of the way the syntax is written. It becomes much, much easier to deal with these really, really painful documents. So that's my big plug for those. Is anyone actually stuck with this problem? Hey, I got 10,000 HTML documents I need to bring over? Like one poor sap. Query path. Query path. Otherwise, interns. Those are your two choices. And I should say, query path's only going to work with well-structured HTML. It had problems. We would run into things like, hey, there's a bold tag inside that H2. That's not really legal, and it would crash. He fixed that, but anyway. So, okay, let's get back to, so how do we do? You've done your data analysis. Right? You know what your source data looks like. You've done your architecture, right? So you know what your Drupal target looks like. And then you have to plan. And these are the kind of things that you're typically going to be bringing across from an external system. Content types, obviously you've got to have set up, and the content that goes with it. You've got to set up your vocabularies. You want to know what your users look like. And you want to know what the dependencies and relationships between all of these things are. Pretty common in projects, especially the ones I find myself doing, that a lot of the authors aren't actually users. And so we have author nodes and we have story nodes. And instead of using the author field, we create a node reference, so, things like that. So you have to have this stuff in place before you get started. This is actually a list pulled straight from the file directory structure of the Migrate module. These are the native formats that it knows how to read. Migrate at its heart is a system for mapping and importing data from one format to a Drupal format. And it keeps track of all that for you. So out of the box right now, it supports these concepts. The multi-items file is kind of odd, and I haven't explored it yet. It's new, and it has to do with CSV files where one record may span multiple rows, and I didn't even understand what that meant, so I skipped it. But it natively understands CSV, it understands JSON. I don't know what list does, actually. But there's an MS SQL driver, there's an Oracle driver. The SQL driver itself works with Postgres and with MySQL. There's an XML driver to it. That's all real nice. It also, these are what comes with it as target Drupal objects. Migrate's sort of core mission is to take external data and map it to an object that Drupal recognizes. And by default, it recognizes these 10 things, right? Where table and table copy actually have to do with database table creation. We're not going to talk about those. But it understands what a comment is, it understands generic entities, it understands fields and files and nodes, and all kinds of great stuff, right? So if you know what your data looks like, it's like, oh, I have 8,000 records in this database and I want to turn them into nodes, the job is already halfway done for you, right? Because all you have to do now is map a node structure. So let's take a look. So this is the Minnesota Public Radio Archive, and I could show you the actual website if we chose to. It's not very exciting. I mean, it's cool in that it's 20,000 radio archives back to 1974, which is, if you're in Minnesota, it's a lot of fun. The first time I did this talk was in Minnesota. So. This is pretty standard. This is a story that they have, and it's got a title and a publication date and an author, and this is the MP3 file in some kind of playback mechanism, whatever. And it's got story copy. There's nothing really exciting there. They have this concept of a collection. Collections are not quite the same thing as taxonomy terms. This caused some confusion during development. But a collection is an arbitrary list of content, sort of an ad hoc editorial collection. It's the kind of thing you could do with a node queue. You could do it in a couple of different ways. Their version of collection is a node type that then you can tag other nodes as part of the collection. Right. That's important. And the last one that I'll show you real quick, this is a feature, and when you're planning your data migration, you really do have to map out your Drupal architecture first. This is interesting. This is a This Week in History feature that they wanted, which is based on a date calculation. And we'll come back to that if we have time at the very end. So these are the database tables that they gave me. Nice little list, exported asset data. That exported bin asset entry is the nasty one. That's a bunch of key value fields that refer to the other two tables. I didn't like that one much. Exported collection bin is actually pretty easy. Exported field type just had some metadata that I needed. This exported topic data, actually, I created in order to make the migration smooth, and we're going to talk about that first, actually, because it's really simple. But this is actually the data structure that they gave me, and we'll look at some of these tables. And I was worried about 4 different things that I needed to do. Right? I needed to create topics so they could tag posts. I needed to create these collections so they could categorize clusters of posts in a different way. I needed to pull in all their contributors, which is kind of fascinating. I needed to bring in all the stories that they had. And in fact, if you know much about Drupal, this is the order in which this has to happen. All right? We'll talk about that in a little bit too. So let's talk about what Migrate module expects. Migrate module is different from feeds in that Migrate does not have a mapping user interface. The data mapping all happens at the code level. Migrate module comes with base classes. It's all object-oriented, and it comes with base classes. This, by the way, for the business people, this is where I go off into total geek talk. So if you want to leave, now is the time to go. So it's all class-based. And I have to say, I mean, I'm a longtime Drupal programmer. I'm a procedural programmer. I don't really understand the magic that is OO, and sometimes I don't like it because it adds complexity for me. Migrate module shone a big bright light down on me and said, oh, this is why you want to write OO structures for certain tasks. And we'll look at some of that. So everything you want to do is an extension of an existing Migrate class. Now what's nice about that is someone already has written, for example, the WordPress story Migrate class and released it as a module, I think, which will take standard WordPress XML and boom, shove it into Drupal for you. Right? And you will find lots of things like that. So all you have to do as a programmer is inherit and extend the default classes. And you write a small module that defines these things, a small module that contains your class definitions. This is the actual module file. We'll look at some of these as we go on. This file is, I don't know, it's about 500 lines of code, maybe. And we'll look at this a little more, in a little more detail. But it's let's look at the base class. It actually, Migrate comes with some really good documentation in the form of actual code examples that come in the download. And they tell you the first thing you do is create an abstract class to hold your primary data that you can then reference with the rest of your stuff. So we start with an abstract class that extends the Migrate module's base class, and then we build everything else off of that. Right. And we can, when we have to, we'll talk about some of this stuff. And it's interesting, we have this team member stuff in the middle, and that's about informing the user interface so people can look and see what's going on. And you can assign different tasks to different people through the UI. It's kind of cool, but I don't use that much. So let's take a look at the UI. So this is why my presentation is in Firefox and not in PowerPoint. So I didn't want to be switching applications all day. So I'm iframing stuff. It took me, Toby, it took me 13 years, and I finally found a use for an iframe. And it's going off the edge of the screen, isn't it? So let's move over a little bit. Anyway, in this case, for the demo, in fact, I've cleared out 3 of mine. The topic, the collection, and the story, I've cleared out all the data. The user I created this morning in case we have extra time, and I'll show you a few things. This is really just the sort of dashboard effect, and it's interesting to me. Where did my cursor go? There it is. It's interesting to me that I'm going to show you drush commands for things, but since I did this project, Migrate 2.2 has come out and put all the drush commands into the user interface, which is really, really helpful. So once you have, this is what's nice about Migrate. Once the developers build the base classes, and once the migration process is established, you don't need the developers anymore. You can set the thing to run on cron, and it'll just keep running. Migrate is smart enough to know, for example, that you just added 10 new records to your source data that don't exist in your Drupal site. And you just trigger the drush command on cron, or whenever you want to, at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it'll update everything. It's really, really interesting. So just a quick little UI look. Let's take a look at the topic one. And it gives you an overview, and this is where my information comes in. This is where the project manager would go, hey, why are we not done with this yet, right? Let me get Bruce on the phone. Call Bruce up. The first bit in the UI, these are all the fields that we know about. And Migrate is really nice to you, actually, because it knows the difference between your source data and your destination data. This destination data, this is actually what a taxonomy term needs. Yeah, that's what a taxonomy term needs in some cases. I've actually split that, I have to say. Excuse me, this is what the taxonomy term means. My apologies. This is the data that a taxonomy term object in Drupal wants. Okay, so Migrate knows this, and it can tell us this. So we want to make sure we map things appropriately. So let's go take a look. So this is my simple migration. This was sort of my proof of concept thing. All I need to be able to do is get the topics list, create the terms, and map the foreign keys into Drupal. And this is again one of the nice things. So here's the live demo part, right? This is I have no topics in my website. Okay. Now this is actually a little peek into my MySQL database. I just created a very, very simple table that says, oh, I have 8 topics. You'll notice the last 2 are actually children of the first 2, which is a little bit complicated. Now, here is the actual class definition for topic migration. And we're going to look at this in a little bit of detail. I keep an eye on the time. In many, many cases, the only thing you're going to need to write in your class is a construct. Ideally, that's all you're ever going to have to write. Because if your data model is simple enough, all you have to do is say, oh yeah, this field in this data maps to this field in this other data, right? So the first thing that we end up doing, we just have a little description at the top. The create vocabulary method I have there makes sure that in my particular instance, I have a place to put these taxonomy terms. It's sort of a hard-coded rule just for this site. This next bit is fascinating. This map is new migrate SQL map. Now, if we were doing a CSV import, it might be this map equals new migrate CSV map. And this is where you define the primary key in your source data. Right? And for those of you who are familiar with Drupal, this is just a schema API definition. Right? And then down here we're saying, oh yeah, migrate destination term, get key schema. Basically, migrate module will tell us how this maps into Drupal. Right? The next thing we have to do is this bit down here. Define the source row. Query equals db select. And the one caveat I'll give you here is you have to use database, the D7 abstraction. You can't use, I did use db select, didn't I? Yeah, you have to use db select. You can't use db query. That's right. You have to use the actual object method to get this to work. And there are reasons for that. And basically I'm just saying that query defines new fields. Right? These are all the rows I care about, which gives you some interesting things. Right? In that query, I could have where clauses if I wanted to. Right? But we won't talk about that quite yet. And then once I've set that up, I can set the source query, which again I'm just calling a common object from the Migrate API, and the destination. Oh, it's a term. Right? So Migrate knows, oh yeah, I'm just running a regular SQL query to a database that I know about, and I'm mapping it to a term. The rest of it is field mapping, and we'll look at that in a bit. So yeah, there's no UI for mapping. I mentioned that. And on the drush command level, you do very simple stuff. You say drush mi topics, boom, unrecognized. Oops, that's because I can't remember the name of my own migrations. Topic. Boom. Processed 8 records, 8 created, 0 updated, 0 failed, 0 ignored, 0.2 seconds. Hooray! The sexiest thing I ever saw in Drush, and I thought about triggering it before I started the talk, and here, by the way, is my topics page after running that command. Right? Magic. Woo. The sexiest thing I ever saw is I had to migrate these 10,000 story objects. Migrate module monitors. Yeah, okay, let me start over. How many of you have ever tried to run node save more than 100 times during a PHP cycle? What happens? You eat all your memory on your box and it crashes. Migrate module monitors memory usage while it's running. When it hits about 80%, it halts the process it's on and spawns a new thread. And I watched this happen once and I went, wait, what? Holy crap. So you can literally just fire it and walk away, go get coffee, go have a donut, whatever, come back and it'll be done. And I love that. And the fact that it's drush means it's scriptable. Right? So that's exciting. So very basic topic migration, and I'll point out now this is what happens in the Drupal table, right? Which is exactly what we expect to see. Very exciting. Now, back there we see the topics again. Oh, let me back this off. Hold on a second.
How did the hierarchy get important like that?
The hierarchy was in the table structure because, hold on.
I saw the 1, 2.
Yeah, there's the 1 and the 2. And then in my field mapping, I can map, well, the taxonomy term object expects a parent ID, which can either be the name of a term, or the term ID of a term, or it can be null. And let me see. I might have to back up to show you this. Hold on. Hold on. It's more of the sexy. Where'd it go? Oh. Okay. That's my little, this is so geeky awesome. Clean up on aisle 2. All right, let me deconstruct this statement I've highlighted for you. This add field mapping, parent ID, source migration, this get machine name, description, parent ID for hierarchies, issue group. Those last two are just for the UI so people know what you're doing. The first one says, hey, parent in my source data, because what Migrate module is going to do is it's going to go out, it's going to fetch a row out of my database and turn it into an object, right? And that object will be row, and it'll have a property of parent. And so the first line there says, row parent equals term parent ID, right? Not a big deal. The problem is, and I can see Doug thinking through his head, he's like, wait, but your term IDs in the source data are not the same as the term IDs that Drupal wants, right? This is the magic. Source migration, this get machine name, is the solution to that, which basically says, and I can't even explain how it does it, but it does. It's basically saying, you want to use the foreign key that's provided by the base table in order to understand what this thing is, if that makes any sense. What gets really wild later when we look at a little more advanced thing, you can actually use this get machine name for a different migration class. Which means when I'm doing story migration later, I might have a topic reference to the source data term ID. And I can say, oh yeah, this get machine name topic migration, right? And it'll know, oh, that's the machine name from this other data source. Use that. So it's basically magic, is that's the answer to your question. It's magic. It's Mike Ryan is a really smart guy. That's the answer. My topic data. Yeah. Let me show you the other part that I love about migration. Drush, MR. Woo, what did I just do? This is where Migrate is better than Feeds, I gotta say. I just said, you know what, that was great, it was a test, it worked, but I want to do another live demo. Right, so Migrate Rollback. Migrate Rollback does exactly what it says. It rolls back everything you just did. Oh, and why is this useful? You're doing a really complex data migration that has like 8 components to it. And they're all chained together, and you find an error in step 7 because you did step 3 the wrong way. You can roll back the entire thing, fix step 3, and re-import. All right. So, yeah, Drush Migrate Rollback. Beautiful thing. And there are lots of other things you can do at the Drush command line. And I have about 16 minutes left. So here is another simple migration, let's call it. This is the collection migration. And you'll notice at the top I have a required dependency on topics because collections map to topics. So I have to be able to do something interesting. The other thing that's nasty here is my query for selecting fields is a little more interesting because they gave me data and they said, well, we only want you to bring across these collections, not these other 20 or whatever it is. So I have a little function that keeps an array of things I don't want, And this is where I said, oh yeah, you can add a field condition to your query, to your source data. So here I'm saying, well, pull me all the collections out except the ones that we know we don't want, which is a lot of fun. Let's look at field mapping a little bit. Most of the time, like I say, most of the time all you need is a construct function. And all you're basically doing is saying, oh yeah, it's named this thing in the source and it's named this thing in the data. You can do some other interesting stuff with it. You can set some default values. Let's see if I do that anywhere. Yeah, this add field mapping is new. That's a node property, and it defaults to true. Yes, we are always creating new nodes. What user should we map to? We default map to user 1. Makes sense. Things like that. Yeah, status. Yeah, by default, right here, by default, make everything published that comes out of the legacy migration. So that's really, really interesting. Let's see. Collections. This is my data source. Don't play that. My team's losing today. I don't want to hear that. Let's go ahead and do. I'm going to do this in a second. Live demos. I did the data peek. I hit the back button, didn't I? This is my list of collections. I don't have any. We're going to do in Drush MI collection. Wow. I'm a good typer. Same thing. Hey, it made 14. There are 14 collections in my data set. Oh, there they are. Yay. Again, pretty exciting. And in the migration UI sort of keeps you updated to where it is. And you can tell these guys are kind of serious. I love the throughput one. The throughput column tells you how fast it created stuff, which is just kind of goofy. But I like that. So let me see if there's anything fancy in this collection one, this mapping. Mapping, yeah, default fields. Nothing exciting. Now, we talked about this a little bit. You can do some other interesting things. I'll show you this on the Drush command line, if I can. Give me a second. And that's not what I want. View. Clear scroll back, that's what I want. Come here. There we go. Drush MR collection. Drush MI collection feedback. Come on, Matt. I forget my own syntax here. Feedback. One item. This is actually really useful if you're running a very long process and you're not sure the computer's doing anything. Right? So if you're importing like 20,000 records, you can just say, give me a prompt every 10 records, just so that I can be sure you're actually doing something. Right? So it's those kind of, it's interesting. I mean, how many of you people are full-bore building sites in Drupal 7 now? How many of you are still languishing in Drupal 6 and lower? Well, one of the big, I would say, one of the big arguments for moving to Drupal 7 is the maturity of a lot of the contrib space is really, really good. A lot of people did some just great work, and that kind of level of detail is just really impressive to me. So we get feedback from stuff. All right, I'm going to show you one more example. I have my collections now. Very exciting. And we talked about that. We looked at that. Contributors I'm going to skip over. Contributors is very, very similar. Blah, blah, blah. Let's talk about dependencies. All right. This is where things get interesting. When I did Foreign Affairs, the dependency chain was like 8 different nodes all interconnected, different node types. So yeah, if nodes have topics and collections are node references, how do I import a story that needs to be tagged with a topic and might be a part of a collection? And that's where the dependencies come in. So we have this sort of model that says, oh yeah, I have a story and it might reference to a topic, and collections might reference to a topic, et cetera, et cetera. So when you set up your construct class, you literally give it an array of things that it needs, And these things must run first. Right? Which reminds, let's see if I can actually do this. Let's see if I did the demo in order. This is my import results. I have not brought any stories across. That's not what I want. I want to. Okay. Let's do this. Drush MI. Oh, come on. Drush MI help. Drush help. I forgot the command I wanted. There we go. Feedback, how do we do this? 4 seconds. Limit. That's what I want. Okay. So let's just try to do drush mi story limit equals 5. Oh, come on. 5 items? Is that what it wants? I brought those in. Incorrect. Never mind. Live demos. Never mind. Oh, it's item limits what I wanted. Item limit. Roll back. Good enough. Anyway, import results. We have stories now. I'm actually interested to know, however, I'll go back to Migrate. Oh, I already have. Okay, let me try that again. Let's try that again, shall we? Let's get rid of our collections. So now I have, this is what I was expecting to happen. I have no collections. And now if I try to migrate a story, skipping migration story due to unfulfilled dependencies. Use force to run it anyway. Yeah, so hey, migrate module, not letting you shoot yourself in the foot. That's a good thing. So yeah. Now I do collection. Yeah. And then for those of you who are not thrilled with doing everything through Drush, let's just to show off, we'll go ahead and do an import of 10 items from story and see if it works in an iframe. It does. So there you go. Nice feature to have. I have 7 minutes. So foreign key handling, we looked at this just a little bit, Doug. This is an example of a very complicated migration. This is the story migration class. And it's complicated because I have a lot of data fields that don't exist, and I have to map a lot of things. But when I'm mapping things, where is what I'm looking for? That's what I'm looking for. Yeah, I was wrong. It wasn't the get machine name method. It's this. So when I want to add topics, I know that there's topic data in my source data. And I want to be able to map that topic source ID to the Drupal TID. So what I say is, oh, the source migration comes from my topic class. And the source argument type is TID. So it's basically saying, hey, when you run into this thing, go back and ask the topic migration mapping, what does this value mean? And I'll show you why this works in a second. Because I know why it works. And I'm going to skip a couple of slides. No, I don't have to. This is why it works. This is the sort of brutal genius of Migrate module that makes these kind of problems easy to solve. In particular, like sort of the rollback thing and doing updates. So it can be sensitive to knowing that data changed, right? Because it's keeping key mapping, your source ID key, your Drupal ID key. And it can actually handle, if you need to, this table is actually dynamically created. And so if you have multi-key tables, it'll do it that way. Right? So if we needed to have, a triplet for the source ID, it'll support that and know how to handle it. So it literally says, oh, hey, someone just gave me, I'm importing a story and it's tagged with term 7311569. What the heck does that translate to? And Migrate just does it for you. And that feature in itself will save you weeks and weeks of anguish. This is the last example that I'll show you. This is where I fell in love with the OO part. I mean, the other OO parts, I used them and I was like, okay, I get it, I'm doing it, but I wasn't very excited. I showed you very early on we had to do this week in history feature or this day in history. Now typically you can do that with views and you do it by doing a date calculation, but date calculation queries are expensive and ugly. And so what we decided to do instead is I built a custom field widget, custom field type called day of year. And all day of year does is attach itself, I can find that, it attaches itself to a parent field and runs a date calculation to say, oh, you selected May 9th, we know that May 9th is day 87 of the year or whatever it happens to be. And then it stores that number in the database, and then I query against that number instead of having to write a really nasty date calculation. Right? It made sense at the time. So the problem is that Migrate module doesn't understand my day of year field because it's not a core Drupal field, right? It understands what a text field is. It understands what a select field. It understands the native Drupal field objects. And it's like, oh, I have to teach Migrate module to recognize my new field type. And this is the code I had to write to make that work. Wow. And this is where I went, oh, object-oriented code makes a lot of sense in this case. Now I understand why people are raving about that in some circumstances. Literally all this does is go into the migrate value field handler, which is the thing that registers all of Drupal's field types with Migrate module, so it knows how to write data into it, and says, oh, hey, by the way, we got a new type. There you go. In traditional Drupal, you do this using a register hook, right? You'd be like hook field types alter or something. But here, the fact that it's a class means that if I needed to do something more complicated than this, I certainly could. But I didn't. I wrote this, I tested it, it just worked, and then there was much rejoicing. So the one last thing that I'll talk about real quick, and then I think we're out of time for questions because we want to. I can stay for like 5 minutes until the next speaker comes in to throw me out. Two questions frequently come up, which number one is, well, what if you're dealing with complex data that doesn't have a one-to-one row mapping of source to target, right? Which is actually very, very common. Migrate comes with two built-in methods that are automatically available to you. The simple one, the one that I use all the time, is called prepare row. The prepare row method basically does the following. Hey, I just grabbed a record out of your source data, right? And it's got these fields. Would you like to add any other data to that or alter that data in any way before I pass it to Drupal's object system? Okay. There's another method called the prepare method, which is even more dangerous. This one's actually really great. You need this one all the time. The prepare method says, hey, I just built a Drupal object out of the data you gave me. Would you like to modify that object before I save it? Really, really useful. Gives you absolute and total control over what you're trying to do. So in my story prepare row, I have to go in and say, oh, hey, I've already derived a broadcast date, and that's a date string. That's what came out of me in the Oracle. And I want to store that in a human-readable format for various reasons. And I want to turn that from one field into two fields in my Drupal installation. All right? And for the life of me, don't ask, because I don't remember why I did it this way, but I did it this way. I don't know why I didn't just store up a Unix timestamp. I don't know. I can't remember. There was a good reason, though. I'm sure there was. But what this basically means is, and so let's say you're stuck with, maybe you've got data in, here's a great theoretical for you, and be a fun challenge. Theoretically, you could write a source input method that you could teach to pull random URLs off the internet and process them into data objects and then shove them into your Drupal website. Right? That'd be fun. Man. So I highly recommend experimenting with that. And this is the sort of screen, why is Migrate awesome? Because it keeps track of all this stuff for you. It's especially good if you have a long project and you want to do a lot of testing. You can import, you can roll back, you can replicate things. It also gives you the ability to do a couple of things that were hard to do in the past, and people often do with things like feeds or domain access. We were talking about this on the drive over yesterday. You can theoretically set Migrate up to have two Drupal instances talk to each other. Those two Drupal instances don't even need to be running the same version. Yeah, think about that for a second. Right? You'd want the Migrate module here to be sitting on your Drupal 7 instance, right? But say you're migrating, say you're upgrading a site from Drupal 5 to Drupal 7. In the time being, while you're doing the dev on the new site, you could be auto-pulling from the Drupal 5 database and auto-updating things so your client doesn't have to do double data entry, right? You could give the client a local install and a live server install, so they never log into the live server. And they just push changes up to the server using Migrate. This is the kind of thing you use deploy for now, and XML, RPC, and all kinds of complicated things. You can, and we were talking about doing this for a client, you could have a network of 8 different websites that want to share certain types of content. And so you have a field on that content type that says, hey, is this a syndicated article? Sure it is. You set up a Migrate instance that maps all those different sites to each other and can know, hey, we just got notified of new content that's supposed to be syndicated. Run the Migrate operation. Right? And again, since it's all Drush supported, you just script that stuff. Right? So there's some really, really tempting possibilities in here. The other nice thing, and the thing that I like about it is such a solid framework. I would put it in the class with those classic modules that everyone loves, like views, right? And like the field API. If you're doing data migration, someone may have done it before. If you're using Vignette or something like that, and in fact, I know this is what the Curve guys do, right? This is what they're going to be doing. It's like, someone will come to Aqua and say, hey, we have to get all of our data out of Red Dot. And they'll go, no one knows how to get data out of Red Dot, and they'll figure out how to do it once, and then they'll just reuse that code forevermore. That kind of collaboration can happen now. And I would bet if we do a lot of little Googling, which I haven't, we can find lots of little plugins that were released for Migrate that solve very special use cases. Right? Oh, you want to do live Joomla sync from 6 different installs back down to one Drupal site. Yeah, Migrate can handle that. So that's my fanboy talk about Migrate module. And my actual professional advice about how do you get data into your Drupal 7 site. I do thank you for your time and attention, and unless they throw us out, I will take questions. Doug.
I had a bear of a time with allowable fields, multi-select field. I imported a CVS or a CSV rather, and that wasn't using Migrate. And because I was importing values that weren't in my allowable list, there was an issue there. I had to pre-populate that actually, which is kind of silly. And also for tagging, you import tags. Is it force-free tagging, or can it be a select list? Do you have to architect that out ahead of time, or is it intuitive?
So the question was, what do you do about Drupal's data entry limitations, right?
Validation of fields.
Right, field validation. Well, it's interesting because Migrate doesn't go through Forms API, so you're not subject to form validation.
Yeah.
So there's that. But the question is, do you have to do free tagging or not? No. The hierarchy, the topic stuff that I brought in built its own hierarchy based on the source data, right? And you could write custom rules in there. How would you handle validation? Well, you'd have to know. In the case of something like this text field is a select list that can only accept red, green, and blue. You have to account for that on the data side. Well, I mean, Drupal, Migrate won't stop you from saving brown, right? But you'll get an error when you go through. Right. Now, what you can do in that case is actually write a very simple helper function or helper method inside your migration class that says, hey, wait a second, yeah, does this field instance that we're targeting understand brown? Oh, it doesn't, let's add that. And figuring out how to do that would take you about 15 minutes, and boom, problem solved. Right, so that's sort of on-the-fly creation. All right, he's coming, he wants to get set up. Ivan, you get the last question because I promised you could heckle me.
If you upgrade from Drupal 5 to 7, is there a way that Migrate module supports NID, keeping the same NIDs?
If you upgrade from, the question was, if you upgrade from Drupal 5 to Drupal 7, will Migrate module support keeping the exact same node ID? The answer is yes, sort of. Because once you start doing rollbacks, every time you do, like, say we import 10 nodes. The first import will be NIDs 1 through 10. And then if you roll it back and import again, your ID is 11 through 20. You could probably force it to in some crazy way, but I wouldn't recommend it. And what you really care about is not the node IDs so much, but the paths and things like that. And so you instead want to protect the human, the human interaction elements. The bigger thing with keeping those node ID keys is like, how do you keep node references in sync? And you can do that with foreign key mapping. Because the foreign key mapping support in Migrate will say, well, node 1 is linked to node 7 in the Drupal 5 version, but in the Drupal 7 version, node 1 has become node 37, and node 7 has become node 52. But it's smart enough to keep that relationship intact because it handles the foreign key mapping for you. And the beautiful thing about the way it handles the foreign key mapping is you, as the developer, never even have to think about it. It just happens as if by magic. So I'll be here all week, folks. So thank you for your time.